The chair was empty. Soren didn't know why that bothered him. He sat at the head of the long table in the great hall, surrounded by 20 of his most trusted advisors, 3 generals fresh from the Eastern campaign, and enough roasted venison to feed a battalion. Candles burned in iron brackets along the stone walls. Conversation rolled like low thunder through the chamber. Everything was exactly as it should be, except the chair. It sat to his left, pulled slightly back from the table as if someone had just stood and stepped away. A plate had been set before it. A goblet of wine, untouched, caught the candlelight and held it like a dark ruby. A cloth napkin was folded into a precise triangle beside the plate. Someone was supposed to be sitting there. The realization crawled through him slowly, like cold water seeping through cloth. He stared at the chair, at the place setting no servant had cleared, and felt something shift behind his ribs. An ache. Faint. Formless. And deeply wrong. "Who sits there?" he asked. His voice cut through the conversation like a blade. The hall went quiet. 20 faces turned toward him, and Soren watched something strange move through the room. Not confusion. Fear. General Aldrich, seated 3 chairs down, became suddenly fascinated with his plate. The serving woman nearest the wall pressed herself back against the stone as if trying to dissolve into it. Across the table, his beta, Calder, set down his goblet with deliberate care and met Soren's gaze. "Your Majesty?" Calder said. "The chair," Soren repeated, gesturing to his left. "Who sits there?" The silence that followed was not the respectful hush of a court waiting for its king to speak. It was the silence of people holding their breath. Of people who knew something terrible and had no idea how to say it. Calder's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. Something careful and heavy, and full of a grief Soren could not understand. "Your Luna, Your Majesty," Calder said quietly. Soren frowned. "I don't have a Luna." The words left his mouth with absolute certainty. He would know if he had a mate. He would remember the bond, the pull, the scent that marked someone as yours. It would be impossible to forget, wouldn't it? Calder held his gaze for a long, unbearable moment. Then he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "You did. Her name was Aelith. She left 3 months ago." The ache behind Soren's ribs sharpened into something with teeth. "That's impossible," he said. But even as the denial formed, his hand had already moved to the chair beside him. His fingers gripped the armrest and the wood was worn smooth in one specific place, shaped by years of someone's hand resting exactly there. Someone who had sat beside him every single night. Someone whose presence had been carved into the very furniture. He tried to picture her, tried to summon a face, a voice, a scent, anything at all. There was nothing. A blank space where a person should have been, like staring into thick fog and knowing something stood on the other side, but being completely unable to make out its shape. "Describe her," Soren commanded, his voice harder than he intended. Calder opened his mouth, then closed it. His jaw tightened, and Soren realized with a sickening jolt that his beta, the man who had stood beside him through a war and never once flinched, was struggling to form words. "She had dark hair," Calder managed finally. "She was quiet. She was kind." His voice dropped. "She loved you very much, Your Majesty." Soren's chest constricted. He pushed back from the table and stood. His chair scraped against stone, and the sound cracked through the silent hall like thunder. "If I had a Luna," he said, his voice dangerously controlled, "I would know. I would remember." No one spoke. No one moved. 20 pairs of eyes avoided his, and the fear in the room thickened into something suffocating. Then Marin, the serving woman near the kitchen door, spoke. Her voice was small and trembling, but her words landed like a hammer blow to the chest. "You looked at her every day, Your Majesty," she said. "You just never saw her." The silence after that was absolute. Soren stood in his own great hall, surrounded by his people, his generals, his power, and for the first time in his reign, he had absolutely nothing to say. Because the chair was empty, the plate was untouched, the wine sat waiting for someone who would never come back to drink it. And the Alpha King, the most powerful wolf in the 5 territories, could not remember his own mate's face. Sleep did not come that night. Soren stood in the center of his chambers, turning slowly, seeing the room as though for the first time. It was wrong. Everything was wrong, and he hadn't noticed until now. The wardrobe against the far wall was large enough for 2, but only his clothes hung inside. The left side was empty, bare hooks and vacant shelves carrying the ghost of folded fabric. He pressed his hand against the wood and felt something catch beneath his fingers. A scratch, small and deliberate, low on the inside of the door frame. Not damage. A mark. Someone had measured their height here, the way a child might against a kitchen wall, except it wasn't a child's height. It was a woman's. His stomach dropped. He moved through the room like a man searching a crime scene. The bed was massive, built for a king, but only one side bore the impression of use. The other side was smooth and cold, the pillows untouched for months. But when he pressed his face to the pillow on the left side, something faint curled through his senses. A scent. So faded it was almost nothing, like the memory of wildflowers pressed between the pages of a book left too long on a shelf. His wolf stirred. Deep inside his chest, something shifted and whined, a sound of recognition so raw and animal that Soren had to brace himself against the bedpost. He tore through the chamber. In the drawer of the writing desk, he found a leathered journal with a worn spine. On the nightstand, a dried sprig of lavender tied with a thin blue ribbon. In the small cabinet beside the window, a collection of hand-labeled tinctures in neat glass bottles, each one bearing handwriting that was not his own, precise and elegant with a slight leftward slant. She had lived here, in this room, in his bed, for years, and he had no memory of her at all. By morning, Soren had emptied every drawer and shelf. The evidence of Aelith sat spread across his desk in damning silence. A pair of reading glasses with thin silver frames, a comb with a few long dark strands caught between its teeth. A stack of household ledgers filled cover to cover in that same careful handwriting, detailing expenses, staff schedules, and inventory with a precision that rivaled his own steward's work. Tucked inside one ledger, a folded note in a different hand, a thank you from a kitchen girl whose wages Aelith had quietly increased after learning the girl was supporting 3 younger siblings. She hadn't just lived here. She'd cared for everyone in this palace, and not a soul had told him, because he wouldn't have listened. He summoned Calder at dawn. The beta arrived looking like he hadn't slept either. He stood in the doorway and took in the scattered belongings with an expression of weary recognition, like a man watching a disaster he'd predicted finally unfold. "How long?" Soren asked without preamble. Calder understood the question. 4 years, Your Majesty." The number hit him like a fist to the sternum. 4 years, not weeks, not months. 4 years of a woman living in his chambers, sitting beside him at every meal, sleeping in his bed, and he could not recall a single moment of it. How is that possible? His voice was barely controlled. Calder stepped inside and closed the door. "We don't know. We've tried to tell you about her many times, dozens of times." He paused, choosing his words with visible care. Each time, something would happen. Your eyes would lose focus. The conversation would drift. By the next sentence, you'd have forgotten what we said. It was as if reality itself refused to let you hold on to her. Soren's blood went cold. "And no one thought to push harder?" "We did push, sire." Calder's voice carried a weight of frustrated years. General Aldrich once brought her to stand directly in front of you during a war briefing. You looked through her and asked him to close the door because of the draft. The silence that followed felt like a living thing. She was standing right there, Calder said quietly. And you felt a draft. Soren sank into the chair behind his desk. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the wood and stared at the ledgers she'd kept, the proof of a life lived in perfect devotion to a man who hadn't known she existed. Why didn't she leave sooner? He whispered. Something shifted in Calder's expression. Pain, carefully controlled, from a man who had watched this slow devastation happen and been powerless to stop it. Because she loved you, Calder said simply. She believed something was wrong. She thought if she could figure out what it was, she could fix it, and you'd finally see her. Soren closed his eyes. Did she? Figure it out? I believe so. Near the end, she was researching something. She wouldn't tell me details, but she said she was close. Calder hesitated, close to understanding why you couldn't see her. Soren's eyes snapped open. What did she find? She never told me, but she left something behind. Calder nodded toward the leather journal on the desk. I suspect your answers are in there. Soren reached for it, his fingers trembling as they closed around the worn cover. The journal felt warm, heavier than it should have been, as if it carried the weight of 4 invisible years. Find her, Soren ordered, his voice cracking at the edges. Send every rider, every tracker. Search every village, every road, every territory border. Calder nodded and turned for the door. Then he paused, his hand on the frame. Your Majesty, he said carefully. When we find her, what then? She didn't leave in anger. She left because she'd lost all hope. That's harder to fix. Soren didn't answer. He couldn't. Because Calder was right, and the Alpha King who had commanded armies and bent nations to his will had no idea how to fix something he couldn't even remember breaking. The beta left, the door closed, and Soren opened the journal. The journal began with joy. Day 1. He chose me. Out of everyone, he chose me. I don't know why. I'm nobody. A healer's apprentice from a village so small it doesn't appear on most maps. But when his eyes met mine at the gathering, something clicked into place inside my chest, like a key turning in a lock I didn't know existed. He felt it too. I saw it in his face. The bond is real and it's ours, and I am so impossibly happy I could burst. Soren's hand tightened on the page. He had no memory of this. None. No gathering, no meeting, no moment of recognition. The bond she described, the click, the key, he should have felt it too. It should have been the most significant moment of his life. It was a blank wall. He kept reading. Day 30. The palace is enormous and I get lost constantly. I turned left instead of right this morning and ended up in the armory. A guard had to escort me back to our chambers. Our chambers. I still can't believe those words. Soren was in a council meeting when I arrived, so I arranged the bookshelves the way I like them and put wildflowers on his desk. I wonder if he'll notice. Day 31. He didn't notice the flowers. He must have been tired. I'll try again tomorrow. Day 45. He hasn't mentioned the flowers once. I've put fresh ones on his desk every single morning. Bluebells, then daisies, then wild violets. Today I put a sprig of honeysuckle directly on top of the report he was reading, and he picked it up and set it aside without looking at it. Like brushing away a fallen leaf, I told myself he was distracted by the border tensions. That's all. He's busy. He has a kingdom to run. Soren's throat constricted. He could feel the optimism in her early entries, the bright warmth of a woman in love making excuses for the man she'd bound herself to, and he could feel, with mounting dread, where it was heading. Day 120. Something is wrong. I spoke to him directly at dinner tonight. I said his name. I touched his arm. He turned, looked in my direction, and his gaze went straight through me. Like I was made of glass. Like I was furniture. Then he turned back to Calder and continued his conversation. Calder saw it happen. He looked sick. Day 200. I asked Calder if the king has ever mentioned me. In private, in passing. At all. Calder couldn't meet my eyes. That was answer enough. Day 365. 1 year. I have been the Alpha King's Luna for 1 full year, and he does not know my name. I sleep beside him every night. I manage his household. I sit at his left hand at every meal, and I am invisible. Completely, utterly invisible. Something is deeply wrong. This isn't neglect. This isn't cruelty. His eyes physically cannot hold me. I've tested it. I've stood in direct light. I've worn bright colors. I've spoken loudly. He doesn't see me. He can't. And I need to understand why. Soren closed the journal. His hands were shaking so badly the pages rattled. He pressed his palms flat against the desk and forced himself to breathe. The wildflowers. She'd put flowers on his desk every morning for years, and he'd brush them aside like debris. He opened the journal again. He owed her that much. He owed her the reading of it. The middle entries were investigative. Aelith had begun researching systematically, consulting old texts in the palace library, exchanging letters with healers in distant territories, cross-referencing accounts of similar afflictions. She documented everything with the meticulous care of a scholar and the desperate urgency of a woman running out of time. Day 500. I found something. In a text on bonding maladies, there's a passage about severed sight, a form of enchantment that severs the victim's ability to perceive their bonded mate. It's not natural. It has to be placed deliberately by someone with knowledge of the bond, someone who knew about us, someone close. Day 501. The enchantment requires proximity to maintain itself. Whoever cast it is inside the palace. They've been here the entire time, watching me suffer, watching me disappear, and they've done nothing. Or perhaps that was exactly their intention. Soren's blood turned to ice. Someone in his palace, someone close to him. Someone who had deliberately made him blind to his own mate. The final entries were sparse. The handwriting had lost its steadiness, the letters shaking with exhaustion and grief. Day 1387. I set a flower on his desk this morning. A white lily. I watched him sit down, push it aside, and begin reading his reports. I stood there for 11 minutes. He never looked up. Not once. 3 years, 272 flowers, and not once has he looked up. Today I stopped. He will not notice. He will never notice. And I cannot keep pouring love into a vessel that has no bottom. I know who cast the enchantment. I found the proof, finally, buried in records that should have been destroyed. A name I never expected. It changes everything, and it breaks what little I had left. I'm leaving tonight. Not because I've stopped loving him. I don't think I could stop if I tried. But because staying is killing me slowly, and I deserve to survive this. Our child deserves that much. Soren stopped breathing. He read the line again, then a third time, each word landing like a separate blow to the chest. Our child. She had been carrying his child. His Luna had walked out of the palace gates, alone, in the dark, pregnant with his heir, and he hadn't known, hadn't seen. Hadn't felt a thing. The journal slipped from his fingers and hit the desk. Soren stared at the wall ahead, at the faded rectangle of lighter stone where something, a painting, a tapestry, something of hers, had once hung. His wolf howled inside him, a sound of such raw anguish that his human body couldn't contain it. A growl tore from his throat, deep and feral and broken, and the desk cracked beneath his hands where his claws had extended without his permission. She was out there, alone, with his child. And someone in this palace, someone he trusted, someone who ate at his table and smiled at his face, had made sure he would never know. Soren stood, his chair crashing backward to the floor. He walked to the door, pulled it open, and found Calder already standing in the corridor, as if the beta had been waiting for this exact moment. She was pregnant, Soren said, and his voice didn't sound like his own. Calder's face confirmed everything he'd known. The grief Soren had seen in his beta's eyes the night before made perfect, devastating sense. I need to find her, Soren said. Now. Tonight. Sire, there's something you need to understand first, Calder replied carefully. The journal. Did you read the last entry? She found out who did this to us. Yes. Calder's voice was barely audible. And the person who cast the enchantment is still in this palace. If you leave now, they'll know. And they'll make sure you never reach her. Soren went still. His claws retracted slowly. His wolf quieted into something far more dangerous than rage, patience. Who? He asked. Calder met his gaze. The last page of her journal, the one with the name, it was torn out. I know, Soren growled. I have it, Calder said, and pulled a folded piece of paper from inside his coat. She gave it to Maren the night she left. Maren gave it to me this morning. He held it out. Soren took it, unfolded it with hands that no longer shook because something inside him had gone very, very cold. He read the name, and the ground beneath the Alpha King's feet shifted forever. Soren stared at the name on the torn page until the letters stopped looking like letters and became something else entirely. A wound, a weapon, a lie 4 years deep. Lady Orenna Veilcrest, his mother. The page trembled in his hand. He read it again, certain he'd misunderstood, certain the candlelight was playing tricks on his exhausted eyes. But the handwriting was Aelith's, steady and precise, and beneath the name she'd written a single line that removed all doubt. She hired the witch. She commissioned the enchantment. She chose to erase me from his life, and she has watched me suffer in silence every single day since. Calder stood motionless by the door. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The look on Soren's face told him the king had arrived at the truth the beta had carried alone for far too long. You knew, Soren said. Not a question. I suspected, Calder replied carefully. Aelith confirmed it the week before she left. She made me swear not to confront your mother until she was safely gone. He paused. She was afraid of what Orenna might do if she felt cornered. Soren's claws extended slowly, digging into the surface of the desk. 5 thin grooves carved through polished wood. Where is my mother now? In her chambers. She dines privately on evenings when court is light. Soren moved for the door. Calder stepped aside but followed close behind, his stride matching the king's, both of them moving through the corridor with the silent precision of wolves on a hunt. The door to Orenna's chambers was unlocked. Soren didn't knock. She was seated by the fire, a book open in her lap, a cup of tea steaming on the table beside her. She looked up when her son entered, and her expression cycled through 3 distinct phases in the span of a heartbeat. Surprise, recognition, and a calm, resigned stillness that told Soren everything. She'd been expecting this. Perhaps not tonight, but eventually. Soren, she said, sit down. Tell me why, he said from the doorway, his voice so controlled it barely sounded human. Orenna closed her book, set it aside, folded her hands in her lap with the practiced composure of a woman who had spent decades navigating the politics of the throne. Because you are a king, she said, as though that explained everything. And she was no one. A healer's apprentice from a village so insignificant the cartographers don't bother naming it. No bloodline, no rank, no political advantage. Her gaze was steady, unflinching. The bond was unfortunate. I sought to correct it. The word hit Soren like a slap. Unfortunate. His mate, his bond, his Luna, reduced to an inconvenience. You hired a witch, he said, each word bitten off at the edges, to cast an enchantment on your own son. To protect my own son, Orenna corrected. You have no idea what a low-born Luna would have done to this court, the alliances we'd have lost, the challenges to your authority. I gave you a clean throne, Soren. I gave you the ability to rule without the distraction of a mate who would have weakened your position. You gave me nothing, Soren snarled, and the sound that ripped from his chest was pure wolf, deep and savage and vibrating through the stone walls. You stole 4 years of my life. You stole my mate. You stole my... His voice cracked, and the fracture in it was worse than the rage. She was carrying my child mother. She left this palace pregnant and alone because of what you did. For the first time, something shifted in Orenna's composure. A flinch. Barely visible, quickly suppressed, but it was there. I didn't know about the child, she said quietly. Because you made sure I couldn't see her, Soren roared. You made sure I couldn't see anything. She stood in front of me. She spoke my name. She put flowers on my desk every single morning for 3 years, and I brushed them aside like dead leaves because your enchantment turned her into nothing. Orenna's lips pressed together. The enchantment was supposed to dissolve the bond entirely. It should have severed the connection within months. Something almost like confusion flickered across her face. It didn't work the way it was meant to. The witch warned me that a bond strong enough could resist, but I didn't believe. A bond strong enough, Soren repeated, and the grief in his voice was so heavy it bent his shoulders. She loved me enough to hold on for 4 years against magic designed to erase her. And you sat in this palace and watched her disappear. Orenna didn't respond. The fire crackled between them. How do I break it? Soren demanded. The enchantment. How do I undo what you've done? His mother's gaze dropped to her hands. I don't know. The witch is dead. She passed last winter. Calder stepped forward from the doorway. The enchantment has had 4 years to take root. Even if the original caster were alive, removal would require proximity to the bonded mate. The curse weakens when the bond is fed, when both parties are close, when connection is reestablished. Then I'll find her, Soren said. Orenna looked up sharply. And if you do, the enchantment has roots in you now, Soren. The longer it's been active, the deeper it's grown. You may stand in front of that woman and still not see her. Her voice softened, but it wasn't kindness, it was warning. And if that happens, you won't just break her heart. You'll destroy whatever's left of it. Soren stared at his mother. This woman he had loved and trusted his entire life, and felt the bond between them fracture with a sound only his wolf could hear. Confine her to her chambers, he said to Calder without breaking eye contact with Orenna. Guards at the door. No visitors. No correspondence. Orenna's face went white. Soren, you are my mother, he said, and I will not harm you. But you will answer for this. Every day she suffered, every moment she was invisible in her own home, you will answer for. He turned and walked out before she could respond. In the corridor, Maren was waiting. The serving woman's small frame was taut with nervous energy, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. You heard? Soren said. It wasn't a question. Maren nodded. I heard everything. She took a breath. And I know where Aelith went. Soren went still. She told me the night she left, Maren continued, her voice gaining strength. She made me promise not to tell anyone unless you asked. Unless you actually noticed she was gone. Her eyes glistened. She didn't think you ever would. The words carved a fresh wound in Soren's chest. Where? He asked. There's an elder healer named Brindis, 3 days' ride north, past the Thornfeld border. She takes in women who have nowhere else to go. Marin hesitated, then added quietly. Aelith walked the entire way. In the rain. She wouldn't take a horse because she said nothing in the palace belonged to her. Soren closed his eyes. Behind them, something burned. Marin, he said. The flowers. On my desk. The ones she left every morning. Marin blinked, confused by the shift. Yes? What kind were they? At the end, the last ones. Marin's face crumpled. White lilies, she whispered. They mean goodbye. He rode out before dawn. Calder had argued against it. The enchantment was still active. The court was destabilized by Orena's confinement, and the king riding out alone into unfamiliar territory with no guard was, in Calder's precise words, spectacularly unwise. Soren didn't care. He'd spent 4 years failing the woman who loved him. He would not spend a fifth. He took his fastest horse, a black mare named Vara who had carried him through the border campaigns, and he rode north through country he'd never crossed as anything other than a king. No banners, no escort, no crown. Just a man chasing the ghost of a woman he should have held onto and never let go. The first village was half a day's ride from the palace. Small, unremarkable, a cluster of stone houses and a single well at the center of a muddy square. Soren dismounted and asked the innkeeper if a woman had passed through some months ago. Dark hair, quiet, possibly pregnant. The innkeeper's face changed immediately. You mean the healer? Soren paused. The healer? Came through in the early autumn. Quiet woman, gentle hands. My daughter had a fever that wouldn't break. 2 days burning up, and this woman sat with her through the night. Made a tea from herbs she carried with her. Sang to the little one until the fever eased. The innkeeper's eyes softened at the memory. Wouldn't take payment. Said helping was enough. Soren stood in that cramped, smoke-stained inn and felt the first true understanding of what he'd lost settle into his bones. Not an abstract concept. Not a name on a page. A person. A living, breathing woman who walked into a stranger's home and sang to a sick child through the night because that was who she was, and he hadn't seen her. For 4 years she'd been exactly this person, this warm and selfless and extraordinary person, and he had looked right through her. The second village told a similar story. Aelith had stopped to help a farmer reset his son's dislocated shoulder. Clean, efficient, painless. The boy had cried, and she'd made him laugh by telling him he was braver than most soldiers she'd known. The third village remembered her too. She'd shown a young mother how to prepare a tincture for colic that worked better than anything the local midwife had tried. She'd left written instructions in that same careful handwriting Soren had seen in the ledgers. Every village knew her. Every village remembered her name. His Luna had been invisible inside his palace and unforgettable everywhere else. The irony was so cruel it felt deliberate, and perhaps it was. Perhaps that was the enchantment's final cruelty, ensuring that the one place she should have mattered most was the one place she ceased to exist. On the third day, the road narrowed to a dirt path winding through heavy forest. The trees grew close and the light dimmed, and Soren felt his wolf growing increasingly restless, pressing against his ribs like a caged thing scenting something it desperately needed. The healer's cottage sat at the edge of a clearing where the forest thinned and the land sloped down toward a cold, bright stream. It was small and well kept, with herbs drying in the window frames and smoke curling from a crooked chimney. Soren dismounted and approached the door. Before he could knock, it opened. Bryndis was not what he expected. She was small and wiry, somewhere past 60, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe knot and eyes the color of winter slate. She looked at him the way one might look at a stain on good linen. "So," she said, "the king. I'm looking for—" "I know what you're looking for." Bryndis didn't move from the doorway. She didn't invite him in. She stood with her arms crossed and studied him like a specimen she found profoundly disappointing. The question is whether you deserve to find it. Soren's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to being spoken to this way, but he was also not accustomed to deserving it, and he knew, with a certainty that ran deeper than pride, that he did. I was enchanted, he said. I didn't know. That your wife existed? Brindis interrupted, one eyebrow arched. That she carried your child alone? That she walked 3 days through rain and mud and arrived at my door so exhausted she collapsed on my threshold? Her voice was quiet, which made it worse. Yes, I'm aware of the enchantment. She told me everything. Then you understand I wasn't cruel on purpose? Brindis finished. Perhaps not. But the result was the same, wasn't it? 4 years of being no one. 4 years of putting flowers on a desk that might as well have been a grave. She tilted her head. Do you know what that does to a person, King Soren? Not to a wolf, not to a Luna, but to a person? He didn't answer. He couldn't. Brindis stepped back from the doorway, not to let him in, but to block his view more completely. She doesn't need rescuing. She's built something here. A life, small and quiet and entirely her own. She has patients who need her. She has a daughter who adores her. She has peace. A daughter, Soren repeated, and the word came out so raw it surprised them both. Something in Brindis's expression shifted. Not softened, exactly, but moved. The healer studied him for a long moment, reading whatever she found in his face with the practiced eye of someone who had spent a lifetime diagnosing pain. She named her Ilara, Brindis said quietly. She has your eyes. Soren's breath left him as if he'd been struck. Aelith can't look at them without crying, Brindis added, and the gentleness in her voice was worse than any accusation. Every time that little girl looks up at her mother, Aelith sees you, and it breaks her heart all over again. Soren pressed his hand against the doorframe. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, which was absurd. He'd stood on battlefields without flinching. He'd faced down rival alphas twice his size, but the image of a woman crying because her daughter had his eyes brought him closer to his knees than any enemy ever had. Please, he said, and the word felt foreign in his mouth. Kings didn't beg, but he wasn't here as a king. Tell me where she is. Brindis regarded him for a final measuring moment. Then she stepped aside and pointed down the slope toward the stream, where the trees thinned and a second smaller cottage sat half-hidden behind a curtain of climbing ivy. She's there, Brindis said. But hear me, King Soren, you're about to walk into something that exists perfectly without you. If you go down there and break what she's built, I will make you regret it. Enchantment or not? Soren nodded once and started down the slope. Behind him, Brindis called out one last thing. And your majesty? She still puts flowers on the windowsill every morning. Even here. Even now. Her voice dropped. Old habits born from love don't die easy. Remember that when she tells you to leave. The cottage door was open. Soren stopped 10 paces away, close enough to see inside, far enough to feel like an intruder in a world that didn't belong to him. Afternoon light filtered through the ivy-laced windows and fell in golden patches across a worn wooden floor. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams in neat bundles. A kettle sat on the hearth, steam curling from its spout. And there, in a chair beside the window with a bundle of white linen in her arms, was a woman. His wolf knew her before his mind did. The recognition hit him with a force that stole his breath and rooted his feet to the ground. His wolf surged forward, clawing at the inside of his ribs, howling with a desperation so primal it bypassed language entirely. Every instinct he possessed narrowed to a single devastating point. Mate. Mine. Found. And then, like a crack spreading through ice, a memory broke through. It came in fragments. The curve of a jaw, a voice humming something soft and melodic while hands arranged wildflowers in a clay vase. Dark hair catching candlelight. A laugh, warm and startled and impossibly bright. The kind of laugh that made you want to say whatever you'd said again just to hear it a second time. The memory shattered as quickly as it formed, splintering apart like glass, and the enchantment rushed in to fill the gap. A sharp, disorienting wave of blankness washed over him, and for one horrifying second, the woman in the chair flickered. Her edges blurred. The warmth drained from her outline, and she became transparent, almost invisible, like looking at someone through frosted glass. No. Soren forced his eyes to hold. He gripped the doorframe until his knuckles turned white, fighting the enchantment with nothing but sheer, desperate will. Slowly, agonizingly, her edges sharpened. Color returned. She solidified. Aelith. She was thinner than the woman in the journal entries would have been. The softness she might once have carried had been carved away by months of solitude and self-reliance, leaving behind sharper angles and steadier hands. Her dark hair was pulled back from her face in a loose braid, and there were shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and worries shouldered alone. She was looking down at the baby in her arms, a tiny thing wrapped in white linen, one small fist curled against Aelith's collarbone. The baby made a soft, contented sound, and Aelith's face transformed. The guardedness dropped. The tension in her shoulders released, and the expression that replaced it was so full of fierce, tender, bottomless love that Soren felt something inside him crack wide open. He must have made a sound because her head lifted. Their eyes met. Time stopped. The stream kept running. The kettle kept steaming. The world continued its ordinary business around them. But in the space between Soren and Aelith, something ancient and enormous held its breath. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She went still, the way a deer freezes at the snap of a branch. And that single reaction told Soren more about what he'd done to her than every page of her journal combined. Aelith, he said, and the name tasted like something he'd been starving for without knowing it. She stood slowly, shifting the baby to her shoulder with the practiced ease of a woman who'd done it 1,000 times alone. Her eyes never left his face, and what he saw in them was not the love she'd written about in her journal. It was something colder, harder, built from the wreckage of everything he'd broken. "You need to leave," she said. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, scraped raw by months of solitude or perhaps by too many nights spent crying where no one could hear. "I can't do that," Soren said. "You can. You've done it effortlessly for 4 years." The words were precise and surgical, designed to cut exactly where they do the most damage. She held the baby closer. "You don't get to show up now and act like you've been searching for something. You can't search for something you never noticed was missing." Each word landed like a blade between his ribs. "I was enchanted," he said, stepping forward. "My mother. She hired a witch to sever my ability to see you. The bond, the connection, everything. I didn't know. I swear to you, Aelith, I didn't know." Something flickered across her face. Pain, quickly suppressed. "I know about the enchantment," she said. "I'm the one who figured it out, remember? I spent 2 years researching while you walked past me in corridors and forgot I existed before you reached the next room." Her jaw tightened. "The enchantment explains why you couldn't see me. It doesn't explain why no one fought harder. It doesn't explain why an entire palace watched me disappear and accepted it." "I'm here now," Soren said, his voice breaking at the edges. "I read your journal. Every word. I know about the flowers, the ledgers, the 3 years of mornings you spent hoping I'd look up from my desk. I know I failed you in ways I can never fully understand. But I see you now, Aelith. I see you." "Do you?" Her gaze was steady, devastatingly calm. "Or do you see guilt? Because those aren't the same thing." The question hit him so hard he physically stepped back. The baby stirred and let out a small warbling cry. Aelith's attention shifted instantly, her hand coming up to cradle the tiny head, her lips pressing against the downy crown with a murmur of comfort so instinctive it bypassed thought entirely. Soren watched her hands move, watched the tenderness in every gesture, and another memory tore through the enchantment's wall. Hands cupping his face in the dark. A voice, her voice, whispering, "I'm right here, Soren, I'm right here. Can you hear me?" Tears on her cheeks catching moonlight. The desperate, gutting hope of a woman trying to reach someone who was standing right in front of her and a million miles away. The memory hit him with such force that his vision whited out. He staggered, catching himself on the doorframe, and a sound tore from his throat that was half cry, half howl, the unmistakable sound of a wolf recognizing its mate through layers of magic that should have made recognition impossible. Aelith flinched at the sound. The baby began to cry in earnest, and Aelith turned away, rocking gently, shielding the child with her body, shielding her from him. "You need to go," she said, her voice tight. "You're scaring her." "Aelith, please. 4 years." She turned back to him, and now the calm was gone. Beneath it was something raw and ragged and barely held together. 4 years I loved you. 4 years I sat beside you and spoke your name and touched your hand and put flowers on your desk and prayed that today would be the day you'd finally look up and see me standing there. Her voice cracked, and the sound split his chest wide open. "Do you know what it's like to love someone who doesn't know you're alive? Do you know what it does to wake up every morning next to someone and know that when they open their eyes, they won't see you?" Soren's vision blurred. Whether from tears or the enchantment, he couldn't tell. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I'm asking you to let me try, to let me see you the way I should have seen you from the beginning." Aelith held his gaze for a long, suspended moment. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, her jaw set hard against the trembling in her chin. "Leave," she whispered. "Please." He opened his mouth to argue, to beg, to say something, anything, that would bridge the chasm 4 years of silence had carved between them. And then his vision flickered. The world stuttered. Aelith's outline shimmered, blurred, began to dissolve. The cottage, the baby, the herbs hanging from the ceiling, all of it started to fade, replaced by a creeping, familiar blankness that spread across his sight like fog rolling across a field. The enchantment was pushing back, hard. His proximity to her was threatening it, and it was responding the only way it knew how, by erasing her. "No," Soren gasped, pressing the heels of his hands into his eyes. "No, no, no." He could hear her. The baby's cries, Aelith's murmured comfort, the creak of floorboards as she stepped back. All of it was there, vivid and real and present. But when he opened his eyes, the space where she stood was empty, not gone. She hadn't moved. He could feel her through the bond, a warm, pulsing presence 3 feet in front of him. But he could not see her. The enchantment had swallowed her whole. And this time, the Alpha King who had torn across 3 days of wilderness to find the woman he loved was standing in her doorway, staring at the place where she should have been, and seeing nothing at all. Soren didn't leave. He stood in the doorway of her cottage, blind to the woman standing 3 feet away, and did the only thing left that mattered. He sat down on the worn stone step, pressed his back against the frame, and began to talk. Not about himself, not about the enchantment or his mother or the palace he'd ridden from. He talked about her. "I followed your trail here," he said, his voice rough and unsteady. 3 days through villages I'd never set foot in, and every single one of them knew your name, Aelith. Everyone. The innkeeper whose daughter you healed. The farmer whose boy you made laugh while you fixed his shoulder. The young mother still using the remedy you taught her. He paused, drew a breath that shook. You walked through those villages exhausted, pregnant, with nothing, and you still stopped to help every person you passed. Silence from inside the cottage, but the baby's crying had softened to small, hiccuping breaths, which meant Aelith was rocking her, which meant she was listening. Marin told me you managed the entire household. The ledgers, the staffing, the supply inventories. She said the palace has been falling apart since you left because no one else understood the systems you built. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, broken and wondering. You ran my kingdom better than I did, and I didn't even know your name. He pressed on. He couldn't see her, couldn't turn around and find her face, so he gave her the only thing he had. Words. Truth. Every piece of her he'd gathered from the people who had actually witnessed her when he couldn't. Calder told me you attended every council meeting. You sat beside me and never once interrupted. But afterward, you'd leave notes on my desk, observations about the advisor's proposals, suggestions I would have been fortunate to hear. I found them in a drawer, a stack of unsigned notes in perfect handwriting that I apparently never read. The silence behind him had changed. It was no longer cold. It was heavy, full of something that pressed against the walls of the small cottage like rising water. I can't see you right now, Soren said, and the admission cost him more than any defeat on a battlefield ever had. The enchantment took you from me again the moment I got close. I'm sitting in your doorway talking to a woman I can't see, because I refuse to let that be the end of us. He turned his head slightly, instinctively, toward the space where he could feel her presence through the bond. Warm and steady and close. Tell me about her, he said softly. Our daughter. Tell me what she looks like. A long pause. Then Aelith's voice, barely above a whisper, came from somewhere to his right. Closer than he'd expected. She'd moved toward him. She's small, Aelith said. The words were cautious, offered reluctantly, like handing something precious to someone who might drop it. Smaller than the healer expected, but strong. She has a grip that could crack walnuts. Soren's mouth curved despite everything. Stubborn? Impossible. A pause. She refuses to sleep unless she's being held. She screams if you put her down. Brindis says she's the most demanding infant she's ever encountered. She sounds like a veil crest, Soren murmured. Another pause, longer this time. Then Aelith said, so quietly he almost missed it. She has your eyes, gray, like storm clouds before the rain breaks. Soren's chest seized. I know, he managed. Brindis told me. The silence that followed was different again. Fragile, trembling on the edge of something. She has your smile too, Aelith whispered. I see it when she's falling asleep. This expression, content, and serious at the same time, like she's satisfied with how the day went and already planning the next one. Her voice broke slightly. It's your face, Soren. Every time she makes it, I see your face. Something cracked. Not the enchantment, not yet, but the wall Aelith had built. He heard it in the way her breathing changed, in the soft, defeated sound that escaped her throat. And then his vision shifted. It started at the edges, a warmth bleeding into the blankness, like dawn pushing back the dark. Shapes emerged, the outline of a doorframe, the suggestion of a figure. And then, for one luminous, breathtaking moment, they appeared. Aelith, standing just inside the doorway, her face streaked with tears she hadn't bothered to wipe away. And in her arms, a baby, tiny and perfect, with a crown of dark hair and gray eyes that found his and held on with the unshakable certainty of someone who had never learned to look away. His daughter looked at him and smiled. The image wavered. The edges softened, threatened to dissolve. But it held, trembling, improbable, alive. I can see you, Soren breathed. Both of you. Right now I can see you. Aelith's eyes widened. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She looked terrified. She looked hopeful. She looked exactly like a woman who'd been burned too many times to trust the warmth. The image flickered and dimmed. The enchantment surged back, pressing against the fragile opening the bond had carved. But Soren had seen them. For one suspended golden moment, he had seen his mate and his daughter standing in a doorway full of afternoon light, and no enchantment in existence could take that from him. "It's not enough yet," he said, his vision clouding again. "But it's breaking. I can feel it breaking." Aelith said nothing for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that sounded less like a wall and more like a door, still closed, but no longer locked. "There's a woodshed behind the cottage," she said. "The roof leaks. If you're going to stay, you might as well fix it." It was not forgiveness. It was not trust. But it was a crack in the fortress, and Soren would take it. "I'll fix the roof," he said. He stayed. Not in her cottage, not in her life, but at the edge of it, close enough to matter, far enough to let her breathe. He fixed the woodshed roof on the first day. On the second, he split enough firewood to last the rest of the season, stacking it against the south wall where the wind couldn't reach. On the third day, he cleared the path down to the stream because the rains had washed loose stones across it, and Aelith carried the baby that way every morning to collect water. He didn't ask permission. He didn't announce himself. He simply appeared at dawn, worked until dusk, and retreated to the spot Brindis had grudgingly offered him in the back room of her cottage, where he slept on a straw pallet and stared at the ceiling and tried to hold on to the fading afterimage of his daughter's face. Each day his vision cleared a fraction more. On the fourth day, he could make out Aelith's silhouette through the cottage window, a dark shape moving with quiet purpose against the warm interior light. On the fifth day, he could see the color of her hair. On the sixth, the shape of her hands as she hung herbs to dry on the clothesline. The enchantment was weakening, not through magic or counterspells or force, but through proximity, through presence, through the bond being fed in small, steady increments by every moment he spent close to the woman it connected him to. On the seventh day, Aelith left a cup of tea on the woodshed step. It was still warm when he found it. He wrapped both hands around it and drank slowly, and the taste, chamomile and honey, and something herbal he couldn't name, unlocked a memory so vivid it buckled his knees. Her hand resting on his shoulder during a late council session, a touch so light he hadn't registered it at the time, the same taste of tea on his lips, and a voice behind him, steady and close, reading over a supply report he'd been struggling with and quietly correcting a calculation he'd missed. He'd never known who fixed it. He'd assumed it was Calder. It was her. It was always her. The memory held. Every detail, the warmth of the cup, the weight of her hand, the particular patience in her voice, remained sharp and present even as the enchantment clawed at the edges trying to drag it back into the fog. On the ninth day, Aelith opened the door and stood in it, watching him repair a fence post near the garden. She studied him for a long time. He could feel her gaze even with his back turned, steady and searching. "You're still here," she said. "I'm still here," he replied, driving the post into the earth. "Why?" He straightened, turned to face her, and for the first time since arriving he could see her clearly, not flickering, not fading. Her. The sharp line of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders, the shadows under her eyes that matched his own. All of it. Vivid and real and devastating. "Because I spent 4 years looking past the most important person in my life," he said. "I won't waste another minute." Aelith's expression didn't change, but her grip on the doorframe loosened, and after a moment, she stepped aside. "Come inside," she said. "Alara hasn't eaten. Your hands are cleaner than mine right now." He crossed the threshold on unsteady legs, The cottage interior materialized around him in full color and detail for the first time. Every dried herb bundle, every neatly labeled jar, every worn blanket folded with care over the back of a chair. Alith's entire world, small and self-made and beautiful in its simplicity. Ilara was awake in her cradle, gray eyes bright and alert, her small fists batting at the air above her. Alith lifted her gently and turned to Soren. She hesitated, her arms tightening around the baby in an instinctive, protective hold. Then she stepped forward and placed Ilara into his arms. The weight of her was nothing. She was impossibly light, impossibly small, a tiny warm bundle that fit against his chest like she'd been designed for exactly that space. Her gray eyes found his and locked on, wide and solemn and curious, studying his face with an intensity that no infant should have been capable of. Soren looked down at his daughter, and the enchantment shattered. It didn't crack. It didn't weaken. It broke, all at once, like a window struck by a stone, and the shards of it dissolved into nothing. In its place, 4 years of stolen memories poured back into him in a single, annihilating flood. The gathering where he'd first seen Alith across a crowded hall and felt the bond ignite like a torch in his chest. The bonding ceremony where she'd worn wildflowers in her hair because she'd said they were more honest than jewels. The first morning she'd made him breakfast and burned the toast so badly the kitchen filled with smoke, and they'd both laughed until their sides ached. The evening she'd fallen asleep beside him on the settee, her head on his shoulder, and he'd sat perfectly still for an hour rather than wake her. The way she'd looked at him one morning across the sunlit chamber and whispered, "I can't believe you're real." 1,000 mornings, 1,000 flowers on his desk, 1,000 small touches he'd never acknowledged, quiet acts of love he'd never returned. Moments she'd poured herself into that had vanished the second they occurred. He remembered her humming while she arranged tinctures on the shelf. He remembered her reading beside the fire while he worked late, her feet tucked beneath her, glancing up every few pages to check if he'd fallen asleep at his desk. He remembered the night she'd pressed her forehead to his back and whispered, "Good night, Soren," and he'd said nothing, because to him, the room was empty. Soren sank to his knees. Ilara made a startled sound against his chest, and he cradled her closer, his arms trembling violently, tears streaming down his face and landing on the white linen of her blanket. "I remember," he gasped, "all of it, every moment. I remember everything." Alith stood above him, and when he looked up, her face was wet with tears. Not the cold, guarded tears of a woman protecting herself. These were the tears of someone watching a door open that they'd accepted would stay closed forever. "You see me," she said. Not a question, a test. One final test. "I see you," Soren said, his voice wrecked and certain. "The woman who managed my kingdom and healed strangers and walked 3 days in the rain and raised our daughter alone and still put flowers on the windowsill every morning because that's who you are." He pressed his forehead against Ilara's. "I see you, Alith. I will never stop seeing you again." Alith's composure broke. She dropped to her knees in front of him, her hands finding his face, his jaw, his shoulders, touching him like she was confirming he was real. He freed one arm and pulled her against him, and she folded into him with a sound that was half sob, half sigh, the sound of a woman finally allowing herself to be held by the person she'd needed for 4 years. "I'm so sorry," Soren whispered into her hair. "I'm sorry for every flower I didn't notice, every word I didn't hear, every morning you woke up beside a man who didn't know you were there." "I know," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "I know." They knelt on the floor of the tiny cottage with their daughter between them, and the bond blazed to life in full, warm, and golden and unbreakable, connecting them in a way that no enchantment could ever sever again. Aelith pulled back just enough to look at him. Her eyes were red and swollen and fierce and full of a love that had survived 4 years of darkness without ever dimming. "Don't you ever look through me again?" she said. "Never," he swore. "Not once. Not for a single second." She studied his face, reading it the way she always had, even when he couldn't read hers. Then she leaned forward and kissed him softly, a small, careful kiss that tasted like salt and chamomile, and the beginning of something new built on the ruins of something that should never have been broken. Alara cooed between them, her tiny hand grasping at Soren's collar and holding on with the fierce, unshakable grip Aelith had described. Stubborn. Impossible. A veil crest through and through. For the first time in 4 years, the Alpha King smiled and meant it. The great hall was full. Candles burned in the iron brackets. Conversation hummed through the chamber in warm, overlapping waves. Platters of roasted venison and root vegetables lined the long table, and the wine flowed freely. Soren sat at the head of the table, and to his left, in the chair that had been empty for 3 months, sat Aelith. Alara was in her lap, one fist wrapped around a wooden spoon she'd claimed from the table and now refused to relinquish. Aelith was trying to eat with her free hand, while the baby gnawed contentedly on her prize. Across the table, Calder watched the scene with an expression he was clearly trying to keep neutral and failing. Marin moved through the hall refilling goblets. When she reached Aelith's, she paused and squeezed the Luna's shoulder. Aelith looked up and smiled, and the serving woman's eyes glistened before she moved on. "You're staring," Aelith said quietly, not looking up from the spoon negotiation. "I know," Soren replied. "It's been weeks. You can stop now." "No," he said. "I don't think I can." She glanced at him, and the corner of her mouth curved, a small, private smile that belonged only to him. On his desk that morning, there had been a flower. A single white lily, placed at the center of his papers where he couldn't possibly miss it. He'd held it for a long time. Then he'd set it in the clay vase she'd placed on the corner of his desk years ago, the one he'd never noticed before. And he'd gone to find her. She'd been in the garden with Alara, pointing at the sky, naming clouds for a baby who couldn't understand the words, but watched her mother's face like it contained every answer worth knowing. Soren had stood in the doorway and watched them, and he hadn't looked away. Not once. Not for a single second. The chair was full. The plate was touched. The wine was drunk. And the Alpha King, who once could not remember his mate's face, now memorized it every morning like a prayer he refused to forget.